She was just a waitress in a fancy restaurant, invisible to the powerful people she served. But one night, a billionaire came to visit him, the very man who ruined her father's life. Little did he know that she spoke his language, remembered his secrets, and carried a truth strong enough to destroy him. Before we start, leave a comment and indicate which city you are sharing from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. They say the city never sleeps, but in this restaurant it does something worse, it watches. The chandeliers hanging like glass cages scatter light across polished marble floors, and every surface reflects the lives of people who believe themselves untouchable. Politicians in dark suits sip Bordeaux as if it were truth itself. Heirs and heiresses twirl forks in silence. Businessmen laugh too loudly, their voices echoing through the vaulted ceilings. The smell of truffle butter, aged wine and expensive perfume floats in the air. But beneath it all there is another scent: restraint. The restraint of those of us who serve, who slip between their chairs unnoticed, who catch their every command before it falls to the floor. I am Maria Johnson. To them I am no more than a shadow. The woman who fills their glasses without spilling a drop, who nods politely when they bark an order, who disappears as soon as the tray is lightened. Sometimes I wonder if I even exist in their eyes. They don't look at me long enough to know. My face is a blur in their memories if I exist in their memories at all. Invisible. That is the word that clings to me like the starch on my uniform. But what they don't see, what they could never imagine, is that every time they lower their voices to whisper about mergers or scandals, I hear them. Every careless gesture, every boast, every cruel remark, I gather them like crumbs. I carry them in silence. My steps are quiet, my hands steady, but my mind does not rest. Behind the mask of service, behind the half-smile they ignore, there is a woman who remembers every detail. I walk among them like a ghost, but I am not without substance. I once studied in the brightest halls of the university, debated professors who admired my quick mind, carried notebooks filled with equations and essays my classmates envied. Yet here I am, carrying silver trays instead of ideas, polishing glasses instead of research. They don't know that when they speak about economies collapsing or governments bending, I understand. They don't know that I see the lies hidden in their polished sentences. Tonight the laughter is sharper, the air thicker with power. My fellow waiters gossip quietly in the kitchen about the guest list. Ambassadors, bankers, the city's most ruthless. They envy their wealth. I study their weaknesses. And as I glide from table to table, my thoughts are not of tips or promotions. They are of survival. Of my father. Of the past that chained me to this life in shadows. I place a glass of champagne on the table of a man who doesn't even raise his eyes to thank me. His conversation continues without a pause. For a moment I catch my reflection in the curve of the glass. Calm, expressionless, unreadable. I have learned to live this way, seen yet unseen. But beneath that still surface, there is something waiting. Because invisibility is not the same as silence. And one day the silence will break. When the guests at the restaurant raise their crystal glasses, when they laugh about their victories or whisper about scandals, I sometimes drift far from the polished tables and golden chandeliers. My mind returns to a different place. The narrow lab where my father once fought for the future with nothing but chalk-stained hands and a heart full of conviction. His name was Thomas Johnson, and to me he was more than a parent, he was a builder of impossible dreams. He believed that the world could be healed drop by drop, that every child, no matter how poor or forgotten, deserved a glass of water untouched by disease. His invention, his miracle, was a water purification system so simple, so inexpensive, that it could have ended thirst in places where entire generations had suffered. He called it the water of tomorrow. For years I believed that tomorrow was ours. But tomorrow never came. It was stolen from us by a man whose shadow still stretches across my life. Richard Gray. He was everything my father wasn't. Wealthy, ruthless, celebrated in magazines that loved his smile more than his substance. He discovered my father's project not with admiration, but with calculation. And when he realized that technology like this would give water freely, leaving no room for profit, he decided to crush it before it could breathe. I was 17 when the destruction began. First came the flattering offers, partnerships, contracts that seemed like lifelines. My father, naive in business but rich in faith, signed too quickly. Then the changes began. Promises of investment turned into endless legal delays. Investors withdrew under mysterious pressure. Bank accounts froze without explanation. The patents we thought secured vanished into the labyrinth of his corporation's ownership. By the time we realized the truth, the lab was stripped bare, the lights shut off, and my father was broken. I will never forget the night I found him sitting in the kitchen, shoulders hunched, staring at his empty teacup as if it contained an answer. "Maria," he whispered. "I thought I was giving the world hope. Instead, I gave it to wolves." That was the moment the fire dimmed in his eyes. Within months his health collapsed. His heart, always fragile, could no longer bear the weight of betrayal. Medicine became a daily battle, and bills arrived faster than I could read them. My scholarship to the university, the one he had worked so hard to see me earn, became useless. Tuition was paid, yes, but who would pay for the roof over our heads? For food. For his medicine. So I left the university. I folded away my notebooks filled with equations and theories, and I traded them for trays, uniforms, and endless shifts. The restaurant became my exile. Here no one knew who I had been. No one cared that I had once stood before professors and argued theories of engineering and ethics. Here I was a shadow that moved silently between tables, rewarded not for my mind but for the way I carried a bottle of wine without trembling. I swallowed my anger because anger does not pay for hospital visits. I hid my grief because grief does not tip well. And yet, even now, even in this place where I am invisible, I carry him with me. In the evenings, when the city lights burn outside my window, I open the box I kept from the ruins of his lab. Inside are fragments of his dream. Sketches of the purification filters, equations scribbled in his uneven handwriting. A few water-stained notebooks that smell faintly of chemicals and time. I touch those pages as if they are relics, sacred remnants of a man the world chose to erase. The guests I serve do not know that while they discuss markets and mergers, their words fall on ears trained to listen, to analyze, to remember. They do not know that behind my quiet smile lies the memory of a man whose legacy they buried in darkness. They do not know that when I look at Richard Gray's name in the newspapers, it is not admiration that rises in me. It is fire. Tonight, as I leave another table and steady myself against the bar for a moment, I hear the maitre d' announce a new arrival. A name rolls through the room, and the air shifts with recognition. Richard Gray. The man who destroyed my father's dream is walking into my restaurant, into my orbit, into the reach of the silence I have carried for years. And suddenly I know my invisibility will not protect me forever. There are moments when a single name can suffocate an entire room. I felt it before I even saw him. The maitre d', usually calm and measured, shifted his tone into something close to reverence as he announced the arrival. Conversations paused mid-sentence, cutlery froze halfway to mouths, and a ripple of curiosity traveled across the tables. I turned my head just slightly, enough to keep up the illusion of professional composure, and then I saw him. Richard Gray. The man who had turned my father's dream into ashes walked through the doors as if he owned the air we were breathing. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never known the word no. His suit was perfectly tailored, his smile sharp enough to slice through steel. Behind him came his assistant, a tall man with slick hair and a briefcase clutched like a weapon. Together they walked through the dining room as though it were a stage built only for them. Guests nodded, some whispering his name with admiration, others pretending not to notice even as their eyes followed his every step. I stayed still, holding a tray of crystal glasses that suddenly felt too heavy. My chest tightened as memories rushed in. The night my father sat in silence at the kitchen table, his hands trembling over medical bills, his voice breaking when he whispered Gray's name like a curse. To the world, this man was a visionary billionaire. To me, he was the executioner of a legacy. The maitre d' led him to the most extravagant table in the restaurant, the one we jokingly called the throne. It was set apart from the others, surrounded by velvet and crystal, placed under the brightest chandelier. Every detail of it screamed superiority. Gray sat down heavily, his hand spreading over the white tablecloth like a king claiming his territory. His assistant leaned close, murmuring notes, while Gray glanced at the menu without interest, already knowing the night would bend to his will. I forced myself into motion, carrying the bottle of reserve wine he demanded. My steps were steady, but my hands tingled with the energy of something I hadn't felt in years. Anger that burned so hot it steadied me instead of shaking me. I placed the bottle carefully before him, bowed my head slightly, and waited for acknowledgement. He gave none. To him, I was just another ghost in a uniform. Invisible, nameless, beneath notice. Cabernet, he said sharply, as if even the word were beneath him. His assistant added, 2 glasses. Chilled. That was all. No thank you. No glance. Not even the pretense of civility. I turned to leave, but his voice rose again, this time aimed at the room, not me. This place has improved since last time. At least now someone understands what class looks like. Laughter erupted from a nearby table, forced and sycophantic. I walked on, my face neutral, but inside his arrogance cracked something open. In the kitchen, I leaned against the counter for a moment, staring at the bottle in my hands. The clang of pans, the hiss of boiling water, the chef's curses, all of it blurred into the background. All I heard was the echo of my father's voice, begging investors to believe in his invention, begging doctors to give him more time. And somewhere behind it all, Richard Gray's laughter. When I returned to the dining hall, I approached his table just as his assistant leaned closer and whispered something in German. I froze. My heart lurched. He thought the language would shield his words, that in this glittering New York restaurant no one would understand. But I understood every syllable. Years ago, my father insisted I study languages, telling me they were keys to lock doors. And now that hidden key opened a door Gray never intended me to see. Nordstern, the assistant said. North Star. The word struck me like a slap. I had heard it before, late at night when my father thought I was asleep. It was the code name for the project that ruined him, the one Gray had buried under contracts and corruption. Hearing it spoken now, casually, over wine and laughter, was almost unbearable. I steadied the bottle, pouring smoothly into Gray's glass, but my pulse thundered. They laughed as they spoke of it, mocking regulators, sneering at that professor who thought water should be free. My nails dug into the wood of the tray, but my face stayed calm. No one watching would know that every word was a dagger, that with each sentence they were confirming the truth I had carried in silence for years. And then, as if fate wanted to test the edge of my restraint, Gray himself spoke in German. His grammar faltered, a small careless mistake. My lips parted before I realized it. For the first time in years, the silence inside me began to crack. I could feel the words rising in my throat, sharp and undeniable. And I knew I was about to stop being invisible. It began as a whisper, but to me it sounded like thunder. Their voices dropped lower, more conspiratorial, as if the golden chandeliers above us could be bribed to keep their secrets. I stood near their table adjusting cutlery, brushing crumbs from linen, every gesture rehearsed 100 times to disguise the fact that my ears were listening with the precision of a machine. Richard Gray leaned back in his chair, his glass raised lazily, while his assistant scribbled on a leather notepad. The language between them was German, sharp, efficient, meant to shield their words from the staff they considered too simple to understand. But I understood. Every syllable fell into place, and with each one the weight in my chest grew heavier. Nordstern. North Star. The name I had heard in hushed tones when I was a girl, when my father believed his work would outlive him. I remembered his voice late at night, weary but unbroken. If North Star succeeds, Maria, no child will drink dirty water again. And yet here it was on the lips of the man who had killed it, treated not as a beacon of hope but as a joke. I gripped the tray tighter, my knuckles pale. Gray's voice was smooth, dripping with arrogance. That professor really thought he could change the world. He laughed in German, his accent clumsy but clear. He gave us the perfect opening. Too honest, too trusting. He never understood that science without profit is just noise. His assistant chuckled, adding something about how the daughter had disappeared after the bankruptcy, how she was no threat, just a ghost. A ghost. That was the word that burned in my ears. To them, I had ceased to exist the moment my father's lab was dismantled, the moment his name was erased from patents and journals. To them, I was not even worth remembering. They believed I was finished, silenced, invisible. My breath came faster, though I forced my body into calm movements, clearing plates, adjusting glasses, folding a napkin with perfect symmetry. I leaned slightly as though refilling a glass, but inside my mind another voice roared. Maria, silence can kill as surely as poison. My father's words. Words I had buried for years, waiting for a moment that might never come. And now suddenly that moment was standing before me in flesh and blood, sipping wine, mocking his memory in a language he thought no one else could hear. I should have walked away. That would have been the safe choice. But safety had already cost me everything. I felt the words rising inside me, sharp and inevitable. When Gray misused a verb, stumbling over a phrase, I couldn't hold back any longer. The correction leapt to my lips before fear could stop me. Actually, I said in German, my voice steady but cold, that is not how you say it. If you want to insult the man who built Nordstern, at least learn the language properly. The air around the table seemed to freeze. Gray's assistant dropped his pen, his eyes darting up in shock. Gray himself stiffened, turning his gaze toward me for the first time that night, as if only now realizing I existed. His frown deepened. "What did you say?" he demanded in English, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby diners. I straightened my back, my hands no longer trembling. "I said your grammar is wrong. And I said my father's name deserves more than your laughter." For the first time, Richard Gray's mask of untouchable arrogance cracked. He stared at me with narrowed eyes, searching my face, perhaps remembering a girl he had dismissed years ago. My heart pounded, but there was no turning back now. The silence that had defined me was gone. And in its place, the truth was about to be spoken aloud. For years I had lived in silence, and I had convinced myself that it kept me safe. But as the last words left my mouth, correcting his German, I realized silence had only chained me to his cruelty. Richard Gray's eyes narrowed, his polished mask beginning to crack. His assistant sat frozen, his pen lying abandoned on the tablecloth, and around us the restaurant had fallen into a hush so deep I could hear the hum of the chandeliers above. Every guest, every waiter, every hidden breath in that gilded room seemed to hover in the space between us. I took one slow step closer, the weight of my own name pressing against my chest. Then, clearly, deliberately, I spoke. "My name is Maria Johnson, daughter of Professor Thomas Johnson, the man you destroyed." The words did not tremble. They cut the silence like glass breaking. Gasps rippled through the room. A banker at the nearest table lowered his fork. A woman in pearls stopped mid-sip of champagne. All eyes turned toward me, the waitress who had suddenly spoken like no waitress they had ever seen. Gray's hand tightened around his glass until the stem threatened to snap. His face hardened. "This is absurd," he hissed, his voice loud, almost theatrical, as if volume alone could turn my revelation into a lie. "Security." I leaned in before he could finish. "Do you deny North Star? Do you deny that you crushed my father's company, stripped his patents, and left him to die in poverty while you built your empire on what you stole?" The assistant shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the guests whose stares now pierced like needles. Gray's jaw worked furiously. "You have no evidence. You're nothing but a bitter girl playing at drama." I could feel the trembling in my legs, but my voice grew stronger. "I have his notes. I have his letters. And now I have your words. Every guest here heard you. Every ear in this room knows the truth, that you laughed about ruining a man who only wanted to give the world clean water." The silence around us was no longer passive. It was charged, restless. The guests leaned in, waiting, as if the restaurant had become a courtroom and I the unexpected prosecutor. Gray slammed his palm onto the table, the glasses rattling violently. "Enough! You will regret this insolence." His face was red, but for the first time I saw fear flicker behind the rage. I straightened, no longer the invisible shadow carrying trays. I was my father's daughter, and I spoke not just for him but for every idea silenced by greed. "No, Mr. Gray. The only thing I regret is waiting this long to speak." Around us the air was electric. The next move would determine everything. And I knew he was about to break. The silence that followed my words was not empty. It was thick, trembling, dangerous. Every head in the dining room had turned toward our table, and I could feel the weight of their stares pressing against my back. For a moment no one breathed. Then slowly the whispers began. They darted from table to table like sparks leaping through dry grass. "Johnson. North Star. Stole it. Destroyed him." I stood tall, tray still balanced against my side though I had long forgotten it. Richard Gray's face was a mask of fury, But behind it I caught the flicker of something else, doubt, maybe even panic. He knew what I had done. I had cracked the shell of silence that protected him. Ridiculous. He spat, rising to his feet. His voice carried through the hall, louder than necessary. A desperate attempt to reclaim authority. This girl is lying. She is no one. A waitress inventing stories to humiliate me. He gestured toward me with the arrogance of a man who believed accusation alone could erase truth. But the room did not believe him. I could see it in their eyes. Some of these people had built fortunes the same way he had, by swallowing the weak. But even they could not ignore the sharpness of my words. The sound of his voice no longer rang with power. It rang with desperation. The manager appeared at my side, his face pale, his hands twitching with uncertainty. "Maria," he whispered. "Please, this is dangerous. You know who he is." I turned to him, my voice steady. "I know exactly who he is. And so does everyone else now." For the first time in all my years here, my manager did not silence me. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and looked at Gray directly. "Mr. Gray, perhaps you should sit down. This establishment will not tolerate threats against its staff." His words shocked me almost as much as they shocked Gray. My manager, who had always bowed to the rich, was standing with me. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Phones had already appeared in trembling hands. A journalist I had served wine to earlier that evening was holding his camera up now, recording everything. I knew in that instant that my words would not stay in this room. They would travel far beyond it, into headlines, into boardrooms, into the court of public opinion where even Richard Gray could not silence them. Gray's assistant leaned in, whispering urgently in German, but Gray shook him off, his face dark with rage. "You will regret this performance," he snarled at me. "Do you think anyone cares about your father now? He is gone. Forgotten. And soon you will be too." I did not flinch. "You are wrong," I said, my voice carrying through the hall. "My father may be gone, but his work lives. And now the world will remember why you tried so hard to bury it." The room erupted. Not with applause, not with cheers, but with something sharper. Questions, murmurs, disbelief, the sound of power tilting ever so slightly away from him. Gray's hand shook as he raised his glass, trying to regain control. But his attempt at composure only made him look weaker, smaller. I had torn the mask from his face. And tomorrow the world would see what I saw tonight. That night I barely slept. Even after the dining hall emptied, even after Richard Gray stormed out with his assistant trailing like a shadow, the echoes of what I had said filled every corner of my mind. The staff avoided me, some afraid, others quietly proud, their eyes shining with something I hadn't seen before, respect. I had broken the silence, and though fear still coiled in my stomach, another feeling rose beside it, release. By morning, release turned into fire. When I stepped out of my apartment and picked up the paper from the stoop, I saw it there in black letters. The Billionaire and the Waitress. The truth at dinner. My hands trembled as I read. The journalist who had been there, sitting quietly in the corner with his phone recording, had published everything. My words, Gray's outburst, even the phrase North Star. It was all there, immortalized in ink and pixels. The city devoured it. By noon the headline trended online. People shared the video, dissecting every frame. Some called me brave, others reckless. But all agreed on one thing. Richard Gray, the untouchable, had been confronted, and by someone he thought invisible. At the restaurant the air was different. Guests whispered not about their business deals but about me. I walked past their tables carrying trays as usual, but now their eyes followed me. I was no longer a ghost. I was a story. My manager pulled me aside, his face tight with worry. "Maria, this could ruin us," he said, but then softer he added. "Or it could save us. Maybe the world needs to hear this." The calls began soon after. Reporters left messages with the hostess, demanding interviews. Activists sent emails offering support. Even a former colleague of my father's reached out, his voice breaking over the phone. "You did what none of us had the courage to do," he said. "You spoke his name again." Meanwhile, Gray tried to strike back. His lawyers released statements calling me unstable, an opportunist inventing lies. But denial is powerless against a truth already spoken aloud. And with every attempt to silence me, more people came forward. engineers who had once worked in my father's lab, investors who remembered the sudden disappearance of his patents. A mosaic of buried evidence began to reassemble itself. I sat at my small kitchen table, watching the storm unfold on the screen of my old laptop. For the first time in years, my father's name was trending, not as a footnote, not as a forgotten casualty of corporate greed, but as a symbol of something stolen. Professor Thomas Johnson, the man behind North Star. Seeing it written there brought tears to my eyes. He was no longer invisible either. Still fear lingered. Power like Gray's does not crumble quietly. I knew he would fight with everything he had: money, lawyers, lies whispered into the ears of those who valued profit above justice. But he no longer had silence on his side. And that, I realized, was his greatest loss. That evening, as I closed the door of my apartment, I found an envelope slipped beneath it. No return address. Just my name scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single sentence on a folded piece of paper. "You've started something you can't control." I sat down heavily, the words burning in my hands. Perhaps it was a threat, perhaps a warning, perhaps the truth. But whatever it was, it only confirmed one thing. The resonance of my voice had reached further than I imagined. And now there was no going back. The days after the article felt like walking through a storm that refused to pass. Strangers stopped me on the street, some whispering encouragement, others just staring, as if I were no longer a woman but a headline made flesh. My phone, once silent except for reminders of overdue bills, now pulsed with messages from unknown numbers, journalists, activists, even opportunists who wanted to use my story for their own gain. I ignored most of them. I had never wanted to be visible this way, but the truth had been spoken, and now it lived a life of its own. I was at the restaurant folding linens when the maitre d' approached me. His expression caught between fear and awe. "There's someone waiting for you," he said softly. "Not a guest. He asked to meet you privately." I hesitated. Another reporter? A lawyer sent by Gray to intimidate me? But when I stepped into the quiet lounge, I found a man I didn't recognize. He was in his 40s, impeccably dressed yet without the arrogance I had come to expect from men in suits. He rose when he saw me, extending his hand not with condescension, but with respect. "Maria Johnson," he said. "My name is David Chuan." I didn't shake his hand at first. "Who sent you?" I asked cautiously. "No one," he replied. "I came because I read your story. Because I believe your father's work still matters." His words unsettled me. For years I had carried those notebooks like relics, too sacred to destroy, too painful to share. Why would a stranger care now? I asked. David's expression softened. "I run an investment firm. Not the kind you're thinking of. We don't build empires, we fund ideas that can't be buried by greed. I'm starting an ethical fund, and I want you to be part of it. I want you to lead a project that revives your father's vision." I laughed bitterly, though my chest tightened with something dangerously close to hope. "You want a waitress to run your project?" "I want a woman who knows what it means to be silenced, who understands the cost of injustice, and who has the mind to build something better. Don't mistake invisibility for weakness, Maria. I see you." The word struck deeper than I wanted to admit. For so long, no one had seen me, neither the girl I had been nor the woman I had become. And now here was a stranger offering me not pity, not applause, but a chance. Still fear wrapped around me like chains. "If I say yes," I whispered, "I'll lose what little freedom I have left. I'll be dragged into battles I'm not ready for." David didn't flinch. "If you say no, then Gray wins again. The world keeps drinking poison water while his empire thrives. You don't have to give me an answer now. But think about it. Think about what your father wanted." He slid a card across the table, simple and unmarked except for his name and number. Then he left me alone with my trembling hands. That night I sat by the window of my apartment, the city lights flickering like restless stars. I opened the box of my father's notes, running my fingers over the faded ink. Could I really do this? Could I step out of invisibility and carry his legacy forward? The thought terrified me. But beneath the fear was something else, something I hadn't felt since I was a girl standing in his lab, listening to him dream. It was possibility. And for the first time in years I wondered if tomorrow could still be ours. The card David Chun left on the table lay on my desk for 3 days before I touched it again. I would pass by it on my way to the kitchen, glance at it when I returned home exhausted from the restaurant, and every time I felt the same tightening in my chest. It wasn't fear of him, it was fear of myself. Accepting meant stepping into a world that had already broken me once. It meant giving Gray another chance to crush me. And yet, ignoring it felt like betrayal, not of David, not even of myself, but of my father. His voice still lingered in every notebook, in every scribbled formula I had kept hidden away. Silence can kill, Maria. Speak when the moment comes. Perhaps this was the moment. On the 4th night, I called the number. David answered immediately, his tone calm, as though he had been waiting. "I hoped you would," he said simply, without triumph. By the end of the week, I found myself standing in the glass tower of his firm, papers spread before me, contracts that did not steal but offered. For the first time in years, someone handed me not a tray of wine, but the tools of change. I signed. And with that, my father's work was no longer confined to a dusty box in my apartment. It began to breathe again. We named it the Johnson Clean Water Foundation. The first time I saw those words engraved on the glass door of the modest office David provided, my throat tightened. It was no empire, not yet. Just a small team, a handful of engineers, and the notebooks I had carried for years. But it was enough. It was a beginning. Days blurred into nights as we worked to reconstruct the process my father had invented. I pored over his equations, translating his crooked handwriting into digital models, explaining his vision to a new generation of minds willing to believe. There were setbacks, endless ones, filters that failed, investors who hesitated, whispers that we were naive. But each time doubt threatened to return, I remembered the way Gray had laughed in that restaurant. His arrogance fueled me more than any applause ever could. Then came the first success. A system installed in a small village in West Africa. Children gathered around as clear water flowed for the first time from a pump that had always delivered sickness. The photos reached my inbox one morning, and I stared at them until my eyes blurred. My father had never lived to see it, but his dream had crossed oceans. Soon after, we expanded to poor towns in the United States, neighborhoods where families spent more on bottled water than on food. I traveled there myself, standing in the dirt as mothers filled buckets with clean water, tears streaming down their faces. They did not know my name, not truly. They only knew that something once denied to them was now theirs. And that was enough. Still, shadows lingered. Gray's name appeared in the news again and again, sometimes tied to scandals, sometimes to triumphs. He ignored me publicly, as if my foundation were too small to acknowledge. But I knew better. His silence meant he was watching, waiting, preparing for the moment to strike back. One evening, after a long day at the office, I returned home to find another envelope slipped under my door. This one bore no threat, only a single clipped article. The headline read, "North Star, was it real after all?" Beneath it, a photograph of my father, young and hopeful, standing beside his machine. No note, no signature, just the article. I sat down, the paper trembling in my hands. Whoever sent it wanted me to know the fight was not over, that the truth was crawling out from the grave where Gray had buried it. And for the first time, I did not feel fear. I felt ready. I never thought I would return to the restaurant. For months, I avoided even walking past its glittering windows, afraid that the scent of truffles and the clink of crystal would drag me back into the invisibility I had worn like armor for so long. But time changes everything. My father's dream was no longer trapped in notebooks and memories. It had a name, a foundation, and living proof in the faces of children who drank clean water because we had fought to make it real. And so one evening, when David suggested we meet at that very restaurant, I agreed. The maitre d' did not recognize me at first. His eyes flickered across my face, then widened with something like disbelief. I was no longer in a starched uniform. I walked through the doors in a dress of my own choosing, my head high, no tray in my hands, no mask of silence. Guests turned to look, some whispering in recognition, others staring as though unsure where they had seen me before. I did not shrink from their gaze. For the first time, I welcomed it. The chandeliers still glittered above, the marble floors still gleamed, but the air felt different to me. I was not walking among giants anymore. I was one of them, or rather, I had become something else entirely, someone who no longer measured her worth by the weight of their approval. David greeted me with a smile, rising from the table where he had been waiting. "Maria," he said warmly, "you belong here now." His words struck me because they were true. I did belong, but not because I had fought my way into their world. I belonged because I had built my own. We sat, ordered simply, and spoke not of empires or profits but of progress. Reports from villages where wells ran clear. Partnerships with schools where children were learning to maintain the systems themselves. Plans for expansion not for wealth but for reach. Every sentence reminded me that invisibility was no longer my story. Halfway through the evening, a woman at a nearby table leaned toward me. "Are you Maria Johnson?" she asked hesitantly. "The one who stood up to Richard Gray?" Her voice carried just enough for those around us to hear. I nodded. She smiled, genuine and unforced. "Thank you for reminding us that one voice can still matter." The words warmed me more than any toast of wine ever could. Around us the room softened, the tension that once suffocated me replaced by something gentler. Acknowledgement, even admiration. But the moment that carved itself deepest into me came later, when I excused myself and walked slowly through the hall. I paused where I had once stood with a tray pressed against my ribs, invisible to the men who laughed at my father's ruin. I closed my eyes and saw her again, that younger version of me who had carried grief in silence, who had believed she was nothing more than a shadow. I whispered to her softly, "You made it out." When I returned to the table, David was waiting with a quiet smile. "So," he asked, "what now?" I thought of my father, of the water that now flowed across continents, of the faces of children who would never know the thirst he fought to end. I thought of Gray, silent now, retreating into the cracks of his empire. And I thought of myself, not as a ghost, not as a waitress, but as a woman who had carried a legacy from the ashes. "What now?" I repeated, letting the words linger. "Now we build a future where silence never wins again." The night ended not with applause, not with triumph but with peace. A peace my father never lived to see, but one he had planted in me. And as I stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights reflected in my eyes, I knew the truth. Even one person, once invisible, can break the wall of silence. And when she does, the world changes.